Welcome to Sleepy Love Tales, soothing romantic stories to help you relax and fall asleep. Let us know where you're listening from in the comments. If soft, heartfelt tales help you unwind, be sure to subscribe so you never miss a moment of calm. Now, let's begin tonight's story. A Rose for Every Year. The little seaside town clung to the cliffs of the English coast like a child to its mother's skirts, braced against the ceaseless wind that swept in from the grey-green expanse of the North Sea. It was a place of salt-stung air, of hardy, windswept roses that grew in defiant clusters along the cliff paths, and of people whose lives were as inextricably linked to the tides as the seaweed that lay in tangled ribbons on the shore. It was the late 40s, a time of quiet rebuilding, of a hope that was as fragile and as precious as the first light of dawn after a long and starless night. It was in this town that Helen first saw the sea not as a barrier, but as a beginning. She was a girl with eyes the colour of the sea on a summer's day, a spirit as untamed as the gulls that wheeled and cried in the vast open sky. She had come to the town to sketch, to capture the raw wild beauty of the cliffs, the endless shifting moods of the water. She sat on a narrow ledge of rock, her sketchbook open on her lap, the charcoal a smudge of black against her fingers, her brow furrowed in concentration as she tried to capture the way the light fell on the churning water below. She was so lost in her work that she didn't notice the sky darkening, the wind picking up, whipping her hair across her face until the first fat drops of rain began to fall, spattering against the pages of her sketchbook. A sudden squall had rolled in from the sea, a common occurrence in this part of the world, but it had caught her unawares. She gathered her things, her heart sinking as she saw the smudged lines of her drawing, the delicate shading now a blur of grey. It was then that she saw him. He was making his way up the cliff path, a tall, sturdy figure in a thick woolen sweater and heavy boots, his face weathered by the sun and the salt spray. He moved with the quiet, steady assurance of a man who knew the sea, who understood its moods and its tempers. He was a fisherman, she guessed, one of the men who went out in the boats at dawn and returned at dusk, their faces etched with the stories of the deep. He saw her huddled against the rock, trying to shield her sketchbook from the rain, and he walked over to her. He didn't say a word, just shrugged off his heavy coat and held it over her, creating a small temporary shelter from the storm. She looked up at him, surprised, and saw a kindness in his eyes that was as warm and as steady as the light from a distant lighthouse. "Thank you," she said, her voice almost lost in the wind. He just nodded, his eyes on the sea. "It will pass," he said, his voice a low rumble, like the sound of the waves on the shore. "It always does." And in that moment, something shifted in Helen. She had always seen the sea as a thing of wild, untamable beauty, a force of nature to be admired from a distance. But in the quiet strength of this man, in the simple, selfless gesture of his coat, she saw something else. She saw a harbour. He looked at me not as a storm to be weathered, she thought, but as a sea to be known, and in his eyes I saw the promise of a calm harbour. The squall passed as quickly as it had come, leaving the air clean and sharp, the rocks glistening with rain. He walked her back to the little cottage she was renting, his coat still draped over her shoulders. He told her his name was Thomas, and she told him hers was Helen. They walked in a comfortable silence, the only sound the cry of the gulls and the distant rhythmic roar of the sea. A few days later she went back to the same spot on the cliffs. The sky was a brilliant, cloudless blue, the sea a calm, glittering expanse of silver and gold. She found him there, waiting for her. He was holding a single perfect white rose, its petals still beaded with dew. "I picked it for you," he said, his voice shy, his gaze steady. "From the bushes on the cliff." He held it out to her, and as she took it, her fingers brushed against his. A jolt, like a spark of static electricity, passed between them. "It's beautiful," she whispered, lifting the rose to her face, inhaling its delicate sweet scent. "It's for the love I felt the moment I saw you," he confessed, his voice so low she had to lean in to hear him. And as she did, he kissed her. It was a gentle, hesitant kiss, a question and an answer all in one. It was a kiss that tasted of salt and roses, of hope and beginnings. It was a kiss that sealed their fate. 1 year later, they stood on the same cliff, the same endless sky above them, the same sea whispering its secrets below. He gave her 2 roses this time, one red and one white. "One for passion," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "and one for the love that holds it, for as long as I have you." He knelt on one knee, the rugged cliffs and the boundless sea as witness, and asked her to be his wife. And Helen, her heart so full it felt like it would burst, laughed a laugh that mingled with the sound of the waves, and said yes. The 1950s and 60s unfolded for Thomas and Helen in a tapestry woven with the bright threads of joy and the darker, more sombre threads of struggle. Their little cottage, perched on the edge of the cliffs, was no longer a quiet retreat, but a place filled with the noise and warmth of a growing family. They had a son, James, with his father's quiet strength and his mother's artistic soul, and a daughter, Sarah, with her mother's sea-green eyes and a spirit as free as the gulls. The cottage was a place of sensory delights, a haven against the wildness of the sea. The air was thick with the scent of Helen's baking, a constant comforting aroma of bread and apple crumble and gingerbread that clung to the curtains and seeped into the very walls of the house. The sound of children's laughter echoed through the small rooms, mingling with the crackle of the fire in the hearth and the rhythmic, relentless sound of the tide, a constant, soothing presence in the background of their lives. The anniversary tradition continued, a quiet anchor in the whirlwind of their busy lives. Every year, on the anniversary of the day he had proposed, Thomas would bring Helen a red rose and a white rose, a simple, heartfelt symbol of the love that had taken root on that windswept cliff and had blossomed in the fertile ground of their shared life. But as the years passed, the subtle, creeping pressures of life began to create a distance between them, a distance as intangible and as vast as the horizon that separated the sea and the sky. Thomas was often away for long stretches on the fishing boats, his life dictated by the tides and the seasons. He would return, his body weary, his hands rough and calloused, his mind still filled with the roar of the sea, and find it difficult to adjust to the quiet rhythms of domestic life. Helen, in turn, felt the weight of her dreams deferred. Her sketchbooks lay gathering dust on a shelf, her charcoals untouched, her artistic ambitions slowly fading like an old photograph. She loved her children, her home, her life, but there was a part of her that longed for the wild, untamed beauty of the cliffs, for the freedom of her youth, for the girl who had sat on a rock and tried to capture the soul of the sea. She saw a change in Thomas too. He grew more withdrawn, his silences longer, his eyes holding a sadness she couldn't quite reach. He would sit by the fire in the evenings, his gaze lost in the flames, his thoughts 1,000 miles away, out on the dark, lonely expanse of the sea. The roses he gave her on their anniversary, once a symbol of their passionate, enduring love, now felt more like a habit, a gesture performed out of a sense of duty, rather than a heartfelt expression of his love. One evening, as she was putting the children to bed, she caught a glimpse of her reflection in the window. She saw a woman with tired eyes and a hint of sadness around her mouth, a woman she barely recognized. We have everything we ever dreamed of, she thought, a wave of sadness washing over her. So why does it feel like we're standing on opposite shores? Thomas, out on the cold, unforgiving sea, felt the distance too. He was a man of few words, a man who had always found it easier to express his love through actions rather than words. But now even his actions felt hollow, his gestures empty. He was a man adrift, lost in a sea of his own making. How do I tell her, he thought, as he stood on the deck of the fishing boat, the salt spray cold on his face, that the sea is not the only thing that pulls me away, that I am lost, and I am afraid of taking her down with me. The 1970s arrived with a chill that had nothing to do with the sea breeze. The world was changing, and so were they. The children were older, their lives a whirlwind of school and friends and their own burgeoning dreams, leaving a quiet, echoing space in the cottage that had once been filled with their laughter. The seaside town, once a place of hopeful beginnings, now felt smaller, more claustrophobic, its familiar routines a constant reminder of the life they had built together, a life that was now beginning to feel like a cage. The ever-present sea, once a symbol of their shared love, was now a symbol of the vast, cold distance between them. It was a constant mocking reminder of the chasm that had opened up between them, a chasm that seemed to grow wider with each passing day. The discovery came on a bleak, windswept afternoon in late autumn. Helen was tidying Thomas's study, a small, cluttered room that smelled of old books and pipe tobacco, when she found it. A letter, tucked away in the back of a drawer, its pages thin and brittle with age. It was a confession, a brief, regrettable affair Thomas had had while away at sea, a moment of weakness, of loneliness, of a desperate, misguided attempt to find a harbour in a storm. The words on the page were a blur, the ink a trail of black against the pale, fragile paper, but the meaning was clear. The betrayal was a quiet, devastating blow, a wound that went deeper than any she had ever known. It was not a grand, dramatic revelation, but a slow, creeping poison that seeped into her heart, chilling her to the bone. She confronted him that evening. He came home, weary from the sea, his face etched with the lines of a hard day's work, and found her sitting in the living room, the letter on the table in front of her. She did not rage, did not scream, did not throw accusations at him like stones. She simply looked at him, her sea-green eyes filled with a profound, aching sorrow, a sorrow that was more devastating than any anger. The house, once filled with the warmth of their love, was now soiled and cold. The air was thick with unspoken words, with the ghosts of 1,000 shared memories, now tainted by the bitter taste of betrayal. "You gave me a rose for passion," she said, her voice a low, trembling whisper. "But you gave that to someone else. What is left for me?" Thomas stood before her, a man stripped bare, his defences gone, his soul laid open for her to see. He had no words, no excuses, no explanations that could bridge the chasm that now separated them. "I have shattered the one perfect thing I ever built," he thought, a wave of despair washing over him, "and I don't know how to piece it back together." For the sake of the children, they continued to live together, two ghosts haunting the rooms of their shared life. They spoke in polite, clipped sentences, their conversations a carefully constructed dance of avoidance, their words as empty and as hollow as the space between them. The intimacy was gone, replaced by a cold, unforgiving silence. On their anniversary that year, Thomas left the roses on the kitchen table. A single red rose, a single white rose, a solemn, desperate plea for forgiveness. But Helen didn't acknowledge them. She walked past them, her face a mask of indifference, her heart a frozen, desolate landscape. The roses, once a symbol of their enduring love, now stood as a testament to their shattered dreams, their wilting petals a reflection of the love that was slowly, inexorably dying. The storm that had been brewing in their hearts for years finally broke on a wild, tempestuous night in the late 70s. A violent storm raged outside, the wind howling like a banshee, the waves crashing against the cliffs with a furious, relentless roar. The sea, that old familiar friend, had become a raging, malevolent beast. Its fury a mirror of the storm that was about to break within the four walls of their cottage. The storm had trapped them together, the the forced proximity a pressure cooker of unspoken emotions. The silence that had been their constant companion for so long was now a palpable, suffocating presence, a tension that was as thick and as charged as the air before a lightning strike. It was Thomas who finally broke the silence. He looked at Helen, her face pale and drawn in the flickering candlelight, her eyes fixed on the storm-tossed sea outside the window, and he could bear it no longer. He broke down, the tears he had held back for so long finally streaming down his face, his body racked with sobs. He confessed everything, not just the infidelity, but the loneliness and fear that had driven him to it. He told her of the long, empty nights at sea, the feeling of being adrift, of being lost in a world that seemed to have no anchor. He didn't make excuses, didn't try to justify his actions. He simply offered her the raw, unvarnished truth of his heart, a heart that was broken and bruised and filled with a regret so profound it threatened to consume him. Helen listened, her own heart a battlefield of conflicting emotions. She saw not a monster, but a man she had loved, a man who was as lost and as afraid as she was. And in his confession, in his raw, unbridled vulnerability, she saw a reflection of her own loneliness, her own fear of losing him completely. In their shared vulnerability, a fragile bridge was built across the chasm that separated them. They talked for hours, their voices raw with emotion, their words a torrent of long-held secrets and unspoken fears. They talked of their dreams and their disappointments, their hopes and their fears, their love and their loss. After the storm of their confessions had passed, a profound quiet descended upon the cottage. The wind still howled outside, the waves still crashed against the shore, but within the four walls of their home, a fragile peace had settled. He reached for her, his touch tentative, a question in his eyes. She leaned into him, a silent yes, a gesture of forgiveness, of acceptance, of a love that had been tested and had not been found wanting. He kissed her, a kiss that was not of fiery passion, but of deep, soul-bearing tenderness. It was a kiss of forgiveness and remembrance, of a love that had weathered the storm and had emerged, battered, but not broken on the other side. His hands traced the lines of her face, the curve of her back, as if relearning her after a long absence. He led her to their bedroom, the room that had been a cold, silent tomb for so long, and in the flickering candlelight he undressed her, his touch reverent, his gaze full of a love that was deeper and more profound than any she had ever known. He laid her down on the bed, her body a pale, beautiful landscape in the soft yellow light, and he worshipped her with his hands, with his mouth, with his body. When their bodies finally came together, it was a slow, sacred reunion, a quiet, desperate affirmation of the love that had weathered the storm. It was a dance of forgiveness and remembrance, a silent promise to never let go again. It was a love that was not perfect but was real, a love that had been forged in the fires of adversity and had emerged, stronger and more resilient than ever before. The years that followed the storm were years of quiet, steady renewal. The love that had been rekindled in the crucible of their shared vulnerability did not burn with the fiery, impetuous passion of their youth, but with a slow, steady flame, a warmth that permeated every corner of their lives. It was a love that was deeper, richer, more profound than anything they had ever known, a love that had been forged in the fires of forgiveness and had been tempered by the harsh realities of life. The annual rose tradition was reinstated, no longer a habit, but a cherished ritual. Every year, on the anniversary of their first kiss, Thomas would bring Helen a red rose and a white rose, a symbol of a love that had been tested and had not been found wanting. The roses were a testament to their resilience, a reminder of the storm they had weathered together, and a promise of the calm, peaceful harbour they had found in each other's arms. They grew old together, their lives a gentle, comforting rhythm of shared memories and quiet contentment. The cottage, once a place of delaminate, aching loneliness, was now a haven of peace and tranquillity, filled with the scent of old books and dried flowers, and the warmth of a love that had stood the test of time. The winter of their lives arrived, not with a sudden frost, but as a slow, quiet chill. With it, Helen's health began to fail. The sea-green eyes that had once held the fire of a wild, untamed spirit now held a quiet, gentle wisdom. The hands that had once sketched the wild beauty of the cliffs were now frail and trembling. But they were never far from Thomas's, their fingers intertwined in a silent, unspoken language of love. On their last anniversary together, Thomas brought the roses to her bedside. She was frail, her breath a shallow whisper, but her eyes were clear and bright, and they lit up when she saw him. He sat on the edge of the bed and took her hand, his touch as gentle as a summer breeze. "One for passion," he whispered, his voice thick with unshed tears as he placed the red rose in her hand, "and one for the love that holds it." He placed the white rose next to it, its petals a stark, beautiful contrast to the crimson of the red rose. She smiled, a faint, beautiful smile that transformed her face, and he leaned in and kissed her, a long, lingering kiss that was full of a lifetime of love. It was a kiss of farewell, but also of infinite tenderness, a kiss that spoke of a love that transcended the boundaries of life and death. They held each other, their breathing in sync, a final peaceful union of two souls who had become one. Years after Helen's passing, a young woman, her heart shattered by a recent breakup, visited the seaside town. She was drawn to the cliffs, to the raw wild beauty of the sea, and she saw an old man, his face a roadmap of a life well lived, standing at the edge of the cliff, a red rose and a white rose in his hand. He placed the roses on the edge of the cliff, a silent, solitary tribute to a love that had not ended, even in death. He saw the young woman, her face etched with the sorrow he knew all too well, and he smiled a gentle, understanding smile. He told her their story, the story of a love that was not perfect but was real, a love that had been tested and had not been found wanting. He told her of the roses, of the storm, of the quiet, enduring love that had been the anchor of his life. The young woman left the seaside town not with answers but with a renewed sense of hope. She had learned that love, in its purest form, is not a fairy tale, but a garden that must be tended, weeded, and cherished through all seasons. And she had learned that the greatest loves are not those without storms, but those that learn to dance in the rain and continue to bloom, year after year, long after the sun has set. In the way she moves. The late autumn air of London, 1970, was a thing of perpetual melancholy. It clung to the bricks of Notting Hill, a cool, damp shroud smelling of coal smoke, turpentine, and the city's unceasing patience. From his cramped top-floor studio, Trenton watched it all through a haze of rain-streaked glass. The world below was a blur of hurried umbrellas, muted greys and browns, a monochrome symphony of transit and indifference. For months this had been his view, and it was a perfect reflection of the landscape within him. His studio, once a sanctuary of creative fire, was now a mausoleum of half-forgotten ambition. Canvases, their faces turned to the wall like ashamed ghosts, stood in silent judgment. He, Trenton, a painter of once celebrated talent, now found himself a stranger to his own art, a man adrift in a sea of grey canvas. He felt a hollowness that no amount of linseed oil or city noise could fill, a creative apathy that was as familiar and insidious as the relentless London rain. He stood by the window, a cup of cold tea forgotten in his hand, a brush as heavy as a lead weight at his side. He had spent the morning trying to capture the shifting light, but all he'd managed was a muddy, lifeless smear. The canvas mocked him. It was a blank slate, a mirror showing him nothing but his own creative emptiness. He had lost the ability to feel, to see, to translate the chaos of life into the ordered beauty of paint. He was an observer, detached and listless, watching the world move on without him. The patter of rain against the glass was the only sound that seemed to reach him, a monotonous drumbeat marking the passage of his uninspired days. And then she appeared. Below, in the archway of a defunct shopfront on Portobello Road, a woman stood alone. She had no umbrella, no hurried gait. Her face was turned up to the sky, letting the fine mist kiss her skin. For a moment, she was a statue, a singular point of stillness in the city's kinetic sprawl. And then she began to move. It was not a performance. There was no stage, no audience, save for the rain and the artist watching from the window above. Her arms swept up in a fluid, instinctive arc, as if she were embracing the very sky. Her body swayed, a slow, deliberate waltz with the elements, a silent conversation between her soul and the falling drops. She moved with a grace that seemed to generate its own private music, a melody of muscle and bone, of longing and release. Her movements were not a dance in the traditional sense, but a pure, unself-conscious expression of something deeply held within. She was utterly herself, utterly alone and utterly breathtaking. Trenton was transfixed. The teacup clattered from his hand, the ceramic shattering on the floor, but he did not hear it. It was as if a jolt of lightning, a fierce, white-hot current, had shot through his dormant veins. For months there has been nothing, he thought, his mind racing. A grey canvas, a grey city. And then there was her. She wasn't dancing for an audience, she was dancing because the rain demanded it. She was the colour, the thought was a revelation. It was the first true, raw feeling he had experienced in what felt like a lifetime. With a desperate, scrambling fervour he hadn't felt in years, he grabbed his charcoal and sketchbook. His hands were unsteady, trembling with a newfound urgency. He didn't try to capture her face, it was a fleeting vision, an impossibility. Instead, he focused on the lines of her body, the delicate curve of her neck, the eloquent slope of her back as she bent to the rhythm of the rain. He worked with a feverish intensity, the charcoal a furious extension of his own reawakened spirit. He muttered to himself, his voice a low, gravelly whisper in the sudden silence of his studio. "Don't look away. Stay still. No, don't stay still, just be." The charcoal scratched and scraped against the rough paper, a stark black line trying to capture the impossible fluidity of a soul in motion. He didn't know who she was or what had brought her to that damp archway, but in her unburdened movement, he had found his muse. He had found his voice, and in a small, forgotten corner of his heart, he found the first stirrings of something far deeper than mere inspiration. He had found a reason to feel again. The world of Portobello Market on a Saturday was a sensory assault, a riotous canvas of colour, sound, and 1,000 overlapping lives. It was the antithesis of Trenton's quiet, melancholic studio, and it was here that he spent his days, no longer in listless observation, but in obsessive pursuit. He was a man consumed, his every waking moment centred on the memory of the girl in the rain. The charcoal sketches from that day were now pinned to his easel, the furious lines a constant silent reminder of the creative rebirth she had triggered. He had started a series of paintings, bold and vibrant, infused with a life he thought he had lost forever. The grey of his world was gone, replaced by a symphony of blues, greens and ochres, all inspired by the ghostly lines of her form. His work was transformed, infused with a breathless, kinetic energy. He haunted Portobello Road, a quiet spectre amidst the boisterous crowds, hoping for another glimpse. He saw countless faces, heard countless voices, but none of them held the silent eloquence of the woman he had drawn. His heart would quicken at the sight of a certain silhouette, only to fall back into a familiar rhythm of disappointment. He was beginning to wonder if she had been a dream, a beautiful hallucination born of his desperate need for inspiration. Then he saw her. She was standing at a stall selling old vinyl records, her back to him. She wasn't dancing, but her hands moved with the same familiar grace, her long, slender fingers tracing the grooves on a record sleeve, a silent, intimate exploration. His heart, which had been a drumbeat of anticipation for weeks, now hammered against his ribs with a sudden, overwhelming force. He felt a nervous heat flush through him, a feeling he had forgotten in his years of reclusion. He approached, his steps careful, hesitant. When he was just a few feet away, he stopped, unsure of what to say to the living, breathing source of his newfound passion. He finally settled on a phrase so utterly mundane it felt like a betrayal of his own emotional turmoil. "It's a good day for the market," he said, his voice a little hoarse. She didn't turn. He waited, a flush of embarrassment rising on his neck. Had she not heard him? He reached out, gently touching her arm, his fingers barely grazing the soft wool of her coat. She startled, turning quickly, her eyes wide with surprise. They were large, a deep liquid brown and startlingly perceptive, a universe of silent thought within them. A small apologetic smile touched her lips, and she reached into her coat pocket, pulling out a little notepad and a pen. She scribbled something quickly, her handwriting neat and elegant, and held it out to him. "I'm sorry, I am deaf." Trenton was stunned. The revelation was not a barrier, but a kind of anointment. He understood now the profound, wordless beauty of her dance in the rain, the unself-conscious grace of her hands. The music stopped, she had written, but the dance did not. He took the notepad from her, his own fingers trembling slightly. He didn't ask about her deafness. Instead, he wrote, his penmanship clumsy and raw with emotion. "I'm a painter. I saw you, last week, in the rain." He then took his sketchbook from his bag, flipping through the pages until he found the charcoal drawings he'd made that day. He held the book open for her, her breath caught in a soft, audible gasp. She looked from the frantic, soulful lines on the page to his face, her expression a mix of shock and wonder, and then a genuine, unguarded smile. A thing of pure, unadulterated light blossomed on her face. In that single breathtaking moment, there was a profound, wordless understanding between them. He saw that she knew he hadn't seen her as a curiosity or a subject of pity, but as a source of transcendent beauty. He saw the recognition in her eyes. He had seen her, not her silence, not what she had lost. He had seen her movement. He had seen her. For the next hour they talked via the notepad, a shared sacred space of ink and paper. He learned her name was Kaylee. She learned his was Trenton. He learned she had been a ballerina, her career tragically cut short. She wrote with a kind of quiet strength. The music stopped, but the dance did not. He wrote back, his heart aching with a tenderness he didn't know he possessed. "You don't need music. You are the music." He told her he had a studio just above them, a haven of light and colour that had been reborn because of her. With a mixture of shyness and hope, he invited her to see the paintings he had started. Her hesitation was visible, a flicker of fear in her expressive eyes, but she nodded. The notepad was passed back and forth, a bridge between two worlds, and in their hands the scent of old paper and ink was a perfume of new beginnings. The studio, once Trenton's lonely bastion, became their shared haven. The low autumn sun, when it broke through the perpetual London cloud, would fill the room with a warm, dusty gold, illuminating the canvases that now pulsed with Kaylee's silent energy. These sessions were their courtship, a slow, tender dance of creation and connection. Kaylee never posed, she simply existed. She would move, her body recalling the ghost of 1,000 practiced movements. She'd show him her ballet exercises, the graceful pliés, the elegant extensions, the small private gestures of her art. He would sit, his brush a silent, furious extension of his will, translating her soul onto canvas. Silence was not an absence between them, it was their shared language, a sacred medium more potent than any spoken word. He watched her hands, her back, the curve of her neck, the same lines he had furiously sketched in the rain, and he painted not what he saw, but what he felt. Her joy, her sorrow, her quiet resilience, it all found its way onto his canvases. The collection grew, a testament to a love born of observation and movement. The centerpiece was a large, unfinished work, a portrait of Kaylee with her face upturned to the sky, a quiet power in her eyes. It was a masterpiece, a culmination of his rediscovered talent and his burgeoning love. The intrusion came in the form of Julian, Trenton's agent. A sharp, polished man, Julian saw not art but commerce. He arrived unannounced one afternoon, his eyes sweeping over the vibrant canvases with a predatory gleam. He was floored, a word he rarely used. "My God, Trenton," he said, his voice a low, reverent whisper. This is a comeback. The best work you've ever done." His gaze landed on the centerpiece. "And the muse, the deaf dancer of Portobello. It's poetic. We'll build a whole exhibition around it. The narrative is gold, Trenton, pure gold." Trenton, a man long starved of validation, was swept up in the whirlwind of Julian's enthusiasm. He saw the gallery lights, the critical acclaim, the return to a world he had thought was lost to him forever. He initially agreed, his head buzzing with the promise of success. When he told Kaylee later, her face, a canvas of emotion in itself, was a story of hope and fear. She was happy for him, her eyes bright with pride. But her joy was immediately overshadowed by a deep, visceral fear. The idea of her private reclamation being turned into a public spectacle, a story of pity and tragedy for a hungry audience, was terrifying. It threatened to cage the very freedom he'd fallen in love with. "But they will see your strength, your beauty," he argued, his written notes filled with a kind of desperate logic he didn't understand. She took the notepad, her handwriting tight with emotion, the words a jagged line of hurt. "They will put me in a box. The world you want to show me to is the one I had to leave. This place, this silence, is ours. Don't give it away." Her words hit him with the force of a physical blow. He felt misunderstood, a sudden cold distance growing between them. Was it her I saw, or just a beautiful story I could paint? He stared at the half-finished canvas, the centerpiece of Julian's dream. It stared back at him, an accusing eye. He felt a sudden, deafening emptiness in the studio, a silence that was no longer a shared sanctuary, but a heavy, impenetrable barrier. Kaylee looked at him, her eyes filled with a sadness that spoke of a betrayal more profound than any spoken word. She had given him the raw, vulnerable truth of her soul, and he had, in her eyes, tried to sell it. The notepad lay closed on the table between them, a dead thing, no longer a bridge but a wall. Kaylee disappeared. She didn't answer the notes he left at her flat, a silence that was more damning than any angry word could have been. Trenton was left alone with his paintings, a beautiful, vibrant collection that now felt like a gallery of beautiful lies. He stood before the half-finished canvas, the one that Julian had coveted, the one he had so foolishly, so blithely agreed to show. He stared at her painted form, her face upturned in a moment of pure, unguarded joy, and he finally truly understood. The art was meaningless without the soul it was meant to honour. He had not seen her. He had seen an idea of her, a beautiful, tragic narrative he could exploit. The thought was a sickening punch to his gut. He realised that the greatest beauty in the room was not the canvases on the wall, but Kaylee herself. The connection, the shared silence, the unspoken understanding, that was the masterpiece. He called Julian and with a quiet, certain finality cancelled the exhibition. He knew he had to find her. He searched the haunts they had shared, the small cafes and bookshops, the winding, chaotic alleys of Portobello Road. She wasn't there. Then a memory surfaced. The old dusty community dance hall she had mentioned once. The kind with worn floorboards and the ghost of 1,000 waltzes in the air. He found her there in the quiet, consecrated space, a solitary figure in the centre of the room. She was dancing, but the joy was gone. Her movements were sharp, pained. An argument with herself, her body a vessel of her heartbreak. The dance was no longer a celebration, but a plea, a silent cry of loss. He didn't interrupt. He waited, standing in the shadows, until the last exhausted movement ceased, and she stood breathing hard, her shoulders heaving in the centre of the room. She caught his reflection in the peeling mirror and froze. He didn't try to explain with more words. Words had failed them. Instead, he took a single piece of paper from his pocket, a fresh, clean page from the notepad that had once been their bridge. He held it up. The words were simple, a single, humble truth. There is no show, there is only you. He walked toward her, closing the distance between them, and didn't speak. He took her hand, his fingers intertwining with hers, and placed it flat against his chest. She could feel the frantic, unsteady rhythm of his heart, a confession of his turmoil, his shame, his love. He lifted his other hand to her face, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw with the reverence of an artist and the tenderness of a lover. His touch a silent prayer for forgiveness. He leaned in and kissed her, and the kiss was everything at once, an apology, a promise and a prayer. It was a slow, deepening exploration, an unhurried claiming. When he drew her close, their bodies pressing together, it was fire and fragility, a silent conversation where every touch said, "I see you, only you." It wasn't about passion as a conquest, but passion as recognition, a profound acknowledgement of her being. He kissed her as if he was breathing her in, relearning and her language through touch alone. His hand slid lower, tracing the curve of her back, and she moaned softly against his lips. The kiss deepened, a tide of mutual need and longing. His hands moved to her waist, pulling her impossibly closer, their bodies fitting together with a heat that made her knees weaken. The studio was no longer just his workspace, it had been transformed, reborn. It was no longer a room of solitude, but a world built for two. The tone was one of quiet, profound joy, a peace that had settled deep within the bones of the old room. A week after the reckoning in the dance hall, he led Kaylee into the space. He had arranged all the paintings, lit them perfectly, a small private gallery for an audience of one. She walked slowly, her hands clasped to her chest, her eyes tracing the familiar lines of her own silent story. The final painting, the centerpiece, was finished. In it, she was not just an anonymous figure of grace. She was Kaylee, looking directly at the viewer, a quiet, knowing power in her eyes, a woman who had found her voice again. The tension that had once clung to the room like a shroud was gone, replaced by a soft, settled intimacy. They were no longer just artist and muse, but partners in creation. He showed her how to mix pigments, the vibrant powders swirling into rich living colour. Her fingers, which had once told stories in movement, now guided his hand on a blank canvas. Her fingers over his, showing him the flow of her movement, a new, shared language of colour and form. The studio, which had once felt so empty, was now filled with the silent music of their collaboration. That night, surrounded by the testament of his love for her, they came together for the first time. It was not a desperate reconciliation, but a joyful celebration, a dance of two people who had finally found their rhythm, their place in the world. He kissed her first, a slow, unhurried brush of lips that was more question than statement. Her response was a soft gasp, an invitation. Their kisses deepened, a silent, searching conversation that spoke of all the longing they had held back. His hands, the same hands that had translated her soul onto canvas, now moved to the buttons of her dress, clumsy with the reverence and need. She met his gaze, her eyes dark and full of a trusting vulnerability, and her own hands moved to the buttons of his shirt. Clothes fell away, a gentle rustle of fabric in the quiet room. He ran his hands over the planes of her body, marvelling at the soft heat of her skin, and she did the same, her touch a discovery of his strength and vulnerability. They moved as one, a seamless, silent choreography, until they found themselves pressed against the cold glass of the window, their naked bodies a warm, living contrast to the rain-slicked pane. He then turned her back to him, her body a perfect, continuous line of surrender against the chilly window. He took her hands and with a tender possessiveness brought them above her head, pressing her full length against the cold glass. Her breath came in short, desperate bursts, a silent cadence of both anticipation and vulnerability. He moved close, his breath hot against the back of her neck, his lips worshipping the lines and curves of her back, the landscape he had first sketched in the rain. She shivered, a low, guttural moan escaping her throat as his touch, his breath, his mouth, traced the path he had once only captured in charcoal, igniting a new, desperate fire on her skin. He lingered there, a reverent artist at work, his hands moving lower to cup her hips and pull her flush against him, their bodies a new, perfect language. The world dissolved into a blur of touch and feeling. He lifted her into his arms and carried her to the bed, their love-making a tender, certain, and beautiful act of creation. The city lights below cast a soft, golden glow on their faces, illuminating their shared breath, her trembling sighs, and a feeling of absolute belonging. He held her, his body a silent anchor to her dance, and in the whisper of skin on skin, in the feel of her heart thudding against his, he knew a truth deeper than any he could paint. He didn't want to leave her now. He knew he believed, and how. In her arms, he was no longer a man adrift, but a man at anchor. Kaylee, too, had found her purpose, a new dance born of their shared silence. She rented the old dusty dance hall twice a week and started a small free class. Not for ballerinas, but for deaf children, teaching them to communicate not just through signs, but through the joyous, uninhibited freedom of movement. Trenton was always there, a quiet, constant presence in the corner, sketching the joyous, silent chaos. He was no longer a reclusive observer, but a quiet guardian of their world, a man who had not only found his art, but had found a love that made the art worth creating. He had spent his life trying to capture truth on canvas, only to find it was not something to be captured at all, but something to be felt in the silent, perfect rhythm of a world built for two. The sound of children's silent laughter, expressed through stomping feet and waving arms, was all the music they needed. Lifeboat number 6. The great ship groaned. It was a sound that went beyond the ears, a low, metallic agony that vibrated in the very marrow of Marguerite Maggie Devereaux. Only moments ago she had been a whirlwind of silken laughter, a bright bird preening for the grand dining room of the RMS Titanic. Now her velvet cloak was ripped, her hair escaping its meticulously pinned chignon in a wild halo of mahogany curls. She was a woman reduced to her most fundamental form, a terrified, desperate animal clinging to a rapidly vanishing life. Maggie, the darling of Denver society, a creature whose every moment was defined by the security of wealth and the bravado of youth, felt her meticulously constructed world splintering into a million icy shards. Just breathe. Just stay on your feet. Don't let them see you're afraid. A Devereux is never afraid. She chanted the mantra to herself, a hollow echo of her father's proud words. But the fear was a living thing, a cold serpent coiling in her gut, and it choked her with the acrid scent of salt water and coal smoke. The deck beneath her feet tilted at an impossible angle, a grotesque funhouse floor. The roar of escaping steam from the great funnels was a primeval scream, a sound of such titanic fury it felt as though the very heavens were being torn apart. Amid the din, the splintering crack of wood and the desperate human cries created a symphony of terror. Above it all, the glittering, mocking lights of the ship hung like a celestial necklace against a black, star-dusted sky, seemed to be plunging head-first into a velvet abyss. Maggie, jostled by a panicked crowd, was pressed inexorably towards a lifeboat. Her innate confidence, a carefully cultivated shell of brash wit and easy charm, was cracking. She had never been a small woman, but here she felt as insignificant as a doll. A Devereux never pushed, never scrambled. They glided, they commanded, but in this moment, Maggie was merely cargo being swept along in a human tide. She stumbled, regaining her footing, her hand clutching desperately at the railing as the deck lurched again. She saw it then, the stark black silhouette of Lifeboat No. 6 swinging low and menacing over the freezing North Atlantic. The sight of the boat was an anchor, a promise of survival, and a fresh wave of adrenaline pulsed through her, wiping away the last vestiges of her cultured facade. A few yards away, a man stood apart from the pandemonium. He was tall and lean in the uniform of a British naval officer, though Maggie knew from the pre-sailing passenger list that he was travelling as a civilian. William Kent was his name. He was a man of quiet angles and sharp edges, his jaw set in a line of stoic resolve. He was directing the loading of the lifeboat with a chilling, detached calm, his training kicking in as surely as an instinct. His hands, gloved in white, moved with a steady, unhurried purpose, helping a frantic mother and her child into the boat, his voice a low, calming presence in the roiling darkness. "Steady on," he said to a man whose terror had made him clumsy. "One foot in front of the other. That's it." He was a man of duty, a man of order, even as his world too was collapsing. His face was a mask of concentration, his gaze fixed on the task, but Maggie saw the slight tremor in his jaw, the flicker of steel in his eyes, and knew that beneath the calm lay a coiled and terrible tension. There was no melodrama in him, no grand pronouncements, just a quiet, unflinching resolve. And then, everything happened at once. A fresh lurch of the ship, more violent than any before, ripped Maggie's hand from the railing. She stumbled, cried out, and was caught in the crush of a wave of people desperately trying to reach the lifeboat. She was airborne for a single breathless moment, and then she fell tumbling head over heels into the boat. She landed in a heap, her cheek scraped, her ribs aching, but she was in. She was safe. She lay there, dazed, gasping for air, clutching at the rough wooden planks beneath her. She felt the heavy weight of a man's body settle against her, his firm hands holding her in place. She looked up, and her eyes, still wide with terror, met his. It was William Kent. He was looking at her, not with pity, but with a gaze so intense it felt like a physical touch. His eyes were the colour of the dark, freezing sea, fathomless and grave, and for a fleeting eternal moment time stopped. The roar of the steam, the splintering of the wood, the cries of the dying, it all faded into a distant hum. There was only the low groan of the ship, and the two of them held in that instant of shared, raw humanity. Maggie Devereux, the socialite who had never known a moment of genuine fear, and William Kent, the naval officer who had trained for every possible outcome, were together, cast adrift in a world of ice and death, united by the most improbable of sparks. The cries from the sinking ship had at last faded into the deep silence of the North Atlantic. The rhythmic splash of oars and the chattering of teeth were the only sounds now, a counterpoint to the terrifying calm that had replaced the roar of the disaster. Maggie, no longer just a spectator, had found an oar. Her hands, unaccustomed to such labour, ached with a dull, throbbing pain, but a fierce, almost defiant determination had taken root in her. She had shed the last of her velvet cloak in the lifeboat, and with it the last pretense of her former life. Now she rowed. Her movements were clumsy at first, a raw, uncoordinated effort born of a desperate need to survive. She watched the man across from her, his movements economical and strong, and tried to mimic him. "You're using too much of your arms," William said, his voice a low, calm rumble into the darkness. "Let your back do the work. Lean into it. That's it. Conserve your strength." He spoke with the quiet authority of a commander, but there was no arrogance in it, only a simple, undeniable truth. He was a man accustomed to leading, and in this small world of the lifeboat, crammed full with frightened souls, he was the centre of a fragile new order. Maggie, stripped of her own authority, found herself yielding to his. She adjusted her rhythm, feeling her back muscles tense and flex, and soon fell into a steady, almost meditative rhythm. The shared work, the unspoken trust between them, began to forge a new kind of intimacy, one born not of flirtation or wit, but of sheer, undeniable need. As the night wore on, a new silence, one of shared vulnerability and quiet fear, settled over the lifeboat. The cold seeped into their bones, but the rhythm of their conversation began to generate a different kind of warmth. Maggie, whose life had been a series of witty quips and charming anecdotes, found herself talking about things that mattered. She spoke of her boisterous, loving family in Denver, her father's larger-than-life personality, and her own wild, untamed spirit, a spirit that had chafed against the confines of polite society. She spoke of her love for riding through the wide-open spaces of the American West, of the sheer, unadulterated freedom of it. William in turn spoke of his own life, a quieter, more regimented one. He was a man of duty, of honour, a man who believed in order and consequence. He spoke of his time as a naval cadet, of the rigid discipline that had shaped him, of the unspoken code of honour that governed his world. He spoke too of a lost love, a quiet English girl he had courted for years, a girl who had died of a fever while he was at sea. The story was told without drama, but in its stark simplicity Maggie heard a history of deep, enduring grief. He had loved her, he said, because she represented all that was steady and good in the world, the quiet anchor that he believed a man needed. When he had finished, he fell silent, staring up at the indifferent, star-filled canopy above them. In that moment, Maggie saw the emotional armour he wore, the wall he had built around his heart to protect it from the chaos of life. She, who had once prided herself on her fearlessness, recognised in him a far deeper and more terrifying courage, the courage to stand alone in the face of an insurmountable loss. They rowed on side by side, their hands raw, their bodies cold, but their souls finding a strange, unexpected closeness. The creak of the oarlocks, the taste of salt on their lips, the shared warmth of a threadbare blanket, these were the anchors of their new reality. Maggie, with a boldness born of the moment, reached out and touched his hand on the oar. He did not pull away. His gaze, once so detached, was now turned to her, and in its fathomless depths she saw a flicker of something new, a nascent understanding, a fragile thread of connection that had somehow survived the sinking of the world. She had never been so vulnerable, and yet in this small, crowded boat in the middle of a vast and frozen ocean, she had never felt so seen. The decks of the rescue ship, the Carpathia, were a new world, a stark contrast to the small, intimate cosmos of Lifeboat No. 6. The chaotic calm of survival had given way to a dawning, terrible reality. The air, once filled with the rhythmic creak of oars and the hushed tones of shared secrets, now held the pervasive scent of hot coffee and the low, mournful murmur of the grieving. It was here, in the relative safety of a new and ordered world, that the chasm between Maggie Devereux and William Kent began to appear. Maggie, her brash confidence returning in the warmth of the ship, was a magnet for the other survivors. She moved among them with a renewed vivacity, her natural charisma drawing out stories, offering comfort, and becoming in her way a small centre of light in the ship's sombre atmosphere. She found herself surrounded by people who spoke her language, whose world she understood instinctively. They were alive, and that was all that mattered. "We're alive," she said to a woman from her deck, a fellow American socialite whose glittering dress she had once envied. "That's all that matters now." She wore a borrowed dress, simple and practical, and her hair was still a wild, untamed mess. But her spirit was once again buoyant, her wit a bright, flashing thing. The chaos had stripped her, but it had not broken her. She was a creature of the sunlight, a woman who needed the noise and bustle of the world to be herself. Her energy, born of her fierce will to live, was contagious, and others clung to it, finding in her a momentary respite from their own grief. William, in contrast, was a man retreating. He stood apart, maintaining a stoic reserve that was a world away from the intimacy of the lifeboat. He was a quiet, internal man, a man of duty, and the public spectacle of the survivors was alien to him. He was a creature of the shadows, of quiet order, and in the bright, chaotic light of the Carpathia, he felt himself withdrawing. He saw Maggie in her element, her eyes bright with a kind of feverish joy, and felt the return of his own emotional reserve, a cold, protective shell he had long cultivated. The bond forged in the lifeboat, an unspoken understanding born of shared fear and struggle, felt thin and fragile, a thing of the night that might not survive the light of day. They found a brief stolen moment together on the crowded deck, the wind whipping at their clothes, the wail of the ship's foghorn a lonely sound in the mist. Maggie, reaching out to him, found him distant, his gaze fixed on the endless grey of the sea. "Are you all right?" she asked, her voice low and hesitant, a far cry from the booming confidence of her public self. "I am fine," he said, and his voice was clipped, polite, a stranger's voice. He looked at her, his eyes cold and grave, and for a moment she felt a chill deeper than the ocean's touch. He saw in her a creature of light, of careless, boisterous life, and felt the return of his old wound, the fear of attachment, the pain of a love that had ended in death. "She is a creature of sunlight," his inner voice whispered, a refrain echoing in the classic literary style of his guarded heart. "I belong to the shadows." As they approached New York Harbor, the sight of the Statue of Liberty through the mist was a promise of a new life, a new world. To Maggie, it was a symbol of her own wild, untamed spirit, a fierce, glorious promise of a future she would shape herself. To William, it was a beacon of a world he did not understand, a world of chaos and sentiment that he had long been trained to fear. They stood together on the deck side by side, but the ocean that had brought them together now felt like an impassable chasm. The unspoken connection, the fragile, beautiful thing they had found in the heart of the frozen sea, seemed to have shattered with the first light of day. The fire crackled in the hearth of Maggie's Denver parlour, its dancing light the only illumination in the room. Months had passed since the sinking, months during which Maggie had tried to bury the memories of that night, to lose herself in the bustling, confident rhythm of a new life, a life built on the foundations of old certainties. She was a woman of position, of privilege, but the memory of the lifeboat, of the quiet man with the fathomless eyes, remained a raw, unhealed wound in her soul. A knock came at the door, sharp and unexpected. Maggie, startled from her reverie, rose to answer it herself. Standing on her porch, framed by the cold twilight of a Colorado evening, was William Kent. He was out of uniform, his clothes those of a civilian, but the stoic resolve of the naval officer was etched in every line of his body. He was determined, his usual reserve stripped away by a terrible fear, the fear of a love that had been forged in a crucible of ice and was now threatened by the light of day. "William," she said, her voice a ghost of its former self, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. "Maggie," he said, and the word was a plea, a confession, a prayer. He came in, leaving the door open to the cold, and they stood in the silent parlour, the firelight casting long dancing shadows on the walls. The intimacy of the lifeboat, of shared suffering and hushed confessions, rushed back, a powerful, palpable force in the quiet room. They talked for hours, long into the night. They spoke of the unspoken, of the fragile, terrified bond they had formed in the open sea. They acknowledged the depth of the connection, the raw, undeniable attraction that had transcended the icy horror surrounding them. He told her of his months of restless nights, of trying to forget a woman who was a creature of sunlight, and failing. She confessed her own struggle, her attempts to return to a life of cheerful ease, a life that now felt thin and false. He moved to her then, drawn by an irresistible force, his usual stoicism a distant memory. The fire crackled and spit, the only witness to their reckoning. He reached out, his fingers trembling, and traced the line of her jaw, his touch sending a shiver through her, a current of longing that left her breathless. He had kissed her once, on the deck of the Carpathia, a brief, desperate kiss of a world ending. This was different. This was a kiss of a world beginning. He leaned in, and his mouth, once a firm, guarded line, met hers. It was not a kiss of desperate urgency, but a slow, deliberate tenderness, a silent promise of a love that had been waiting, smouldering in the dark for months. His hands moved to her hair, his fingers tangling in the soft curls, freeing them from their pins and brushes, letting them fall in a wild cascade around her face. Her hands came up to cup his face, her thumbs stroking his cheeks, tracing the sharp, proud line of his bone structure. The kiss deepened, becoming more insistent, a wordless conversation of need and desire. His mouth became a demand, a reverent exploration of her. He kissed her like a man possessed by a beautiful and terrible hunger. Clothes were shed with a sense of ceremony, of unveiling something sacred. Skin met skin in a heated rush, a silent, breathless communion. He laid her back on the thick fur rug in front of the fire, his body a warm, solid weight against hers. His eyes, fixed on hers, held a silent question in their depths. She answered with a soft gasp, a slight arch of her back, a silent plea for more. His hand slid lower, exploring her with a mixture of reverence and hunger, his touch sending a tremor of pleasure through her. He moved within her slowly at first, his eyes never leaving hers, savouring the way her body arched and trembled beneath his touch, then faster as their shared need consumed them in waves of pleasure. He gave himself to her with a completeness she had never known, his body a language of shared trauma and shared survival, of a love that was forged in the heart of a frozen sea. She clung to him with a hiss of wonder that was almost awe, her body quivering, unconscious and alive, like plasm. They moved as one, a symphony of touch and taste and scent, their breaths coming in rhythmic counterpoint to the crackling fire. He pulled her into a slow, deliberate embrace, their eyes locked, and she answered with a soft gasp, a silent arch of her back, a plea for more. He moved within her, a slow rhythmic dance that built in intensity, until they were a single, breathless, shuddering communion. Their bodies spoke a language of their own, a language of a love that was born in the heart of a frozen sea and had bloomed into something eternal. He felt her frenzy, her wild, passionate activity, and responded in kind, a deep and powerful giving that spoke of a surrender to a love as vast and terrifying as the ocean that had brought them together. In this year's vulnerable intimacy, Maggie felt the last of her old self melt away, and a new woman, unafraid of her own desires, emerged in the firelight. After the breathless climax, he did not recede, but remained intertwined with her, his presence a warm, steady beat against her heart. She felt a profound, beautiful vulnerability, and tears of pure wonder streamed silently down her face. He held her close, his embrace a silent promise of forever, and in the quiet of the room she knew with every fibre of her being that she was not alone. Their love, born of desperation and forged in the heart of a frozen sea, was a thing of truth and magnificent beauty. The Denver sun, wild and untamed as the landscape it illuminated, streamed through the windows of Maggie and William's new home. It was a sprawling house filled with the warmth of loving chaos, and it was here, amidst the wild beauty of the American West, that their love found its footing. William, having resigned his commission, had made a new life for himself. The man who had once believed so fiercely in order and discipline had found a different kind of peace in the beautiful, boisterous world Maggie had introduced him to. His love for her was a grounding force, a quiet anchor in the untamed landscape of a life lived for passion, not duty. He was a man of the shadows, but with Maggie, he had stepped into the light. Maggie, in turn, had found a new sense of purpose. Her brash spirit, once a mask for a deep-seated vulnerability, was now tempered by a newfound emotional depth. She had discovered in herself a well of strength she never knew she possessed, and her love for William allowed her to be both strong and soft, both brash and tender. They were married in a small, intimate ceremony, surrounded by Maggie's boisterous, loving family. The wedding was a testament to the life they had built together, a life of honest love and quiet courage, a life that had been born in a lifeboat and had bloomed in the open air of the West. Months later, they stood on the porch of their new home, the setting sun painting the sky in hues of orange and purple. The scent of pine and sagebrush was thick on the air, and the feel of the rough-hewn wood of the porch railing beneath their hands was a physical reminder of the solid world they had built together. William wrapped his arms around her from behind, his hands resting on her belly. He held her close, feeling the warmth of her body against his, feeling the steady beat of her heart, a rhythm that was now his own. "I never thought I could be this happy," he said, his voice a low rumble against her ear. Maggie leaned back against him, her head resting on his shoulder. The endless star-filled sky stretched out before them, a constant presence in their darkest moments, and a reminder of the vast, miraculous universe in which they had found each other. "I knew," she said, her voice soft and full of a quiet certainty. "From the moment you pulled me into that lifeboat, I knew." He turned her in his arms, his eyes searching hers, his gaze dark and tender, and full of a promise that made her heart ache. "I love you, Maggie Devereaux," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "And I," she said, her voice catching, "love you, William Kent." He kissed her then, a kiss that was both a promise and a prayer, a testament to a love that was not born of fear, but of a shared and desperate hope. In the heart of a frozen sea they had found a warmth that defied the cold, and in the light of a new day they had found a love that defied the odds, a love that was and is and always will be their lifeboat. An Enemy's Refuge. The Highlands, in the year of our Lord 1520, were a land steeped in a raw, untamed beauty that bled into every heart that called them home. In Glenartney, the air itself was a wild, clean thing, sharp with the scent of crushed heather and wet moss clinging to the mist. It was a place that did not suffer the weak or the unwary, a land of ancient secrets and sudden, brutal violence. It was here, in this perilous heart of Scotland, that Eden MacInnes, a royal courier in the service of the young King James V, found himself running from the ghosts of a battle he had lost. His horse, a brave Galloway pony that had carried him with loyal haste for 2 days, had stumbled and fallen in a treacherous pass, leaving Eden to the wolves that hunted in the shadows. He had a secret dispatch from the king, a missive with the royal seal that felt like a brand against his heart. As he fled, wounded and disoriented, through the rugged passes of the Trossachs, the thick grey sky mirrored the chaos in his soul. He was a man of the lowlands, a man of law and order, raised on the principles of loyalty to the crown, and the wildness of this land was an enemy he did not know how to fight. The world had turned against him, and the blood that now stained his king's livery felt like a premonition of his own ruin. He collapsed near a secluded loch, the icy spray of its dark water a sharp shock against his fevered skin. He lay there, his strength failing, the weight of the king's signet ring on a chain around his neck feeling heavier than stone. He was a courier with an important message, a man of duty, and yet he was powerless, sinking into a world of pain and delirium. The seal must protect the seal, he murmured, the words lost to the wind, his consciousness fraying like a tattered flag. It was Isla McLaren who found him. She was walking along the water's edge, her basket filled with medicinal herbs whose names were whispered only by the women of her clan. As she knelt by the loch, her deft fingers plucking at watermint and the dark, potent leaves of foxglove, she saw him half hidden among the tall ferns. He was a man, surely, but the bright red and yellow of his doublet spoke of the king's colours, the livery of the men who hunted her father, the MacLaren chieftain. As a royal outlaw, to touch him was to risk everything. Her clan's deep-seated hatred for the crown was a bond forged in blood and fire, a law unto itself that brooked no mercy for those who served the king. But as she looked at his still pale face, at the wound on his shoulder, and at the raw vulnerability of his sleeping form, a stronger, more ancient law stirred within her. The wind that had been biting at her cheek suddenly seemed to carry a different message, a plea for compassion that echoed in her heart. She thought of what her father, a man bound by his own code of hospitality, would do, but he was far away, leading his men in a raid against a rival clan. Her brother, a hot-headed warrior, would have slit the courier's throat without a second thought. But Isla, raised in the lonely wilds, possessed a quiet strength born of a different kind of knowledge. She knew the power of healing herbs, the rhythm of the seasons, the secrets of the loch. She was a daughter of the MacLarens, but she was a woman first, and to leave a wounded man to the wolves and the cold was a sin she could not bear. With a strength she did not know she possessed, she dragged him to her small hidden bothy. It was a place carved out of the earth, sheltered by ancient pines and the treacherous currents of the loch. The rhythmic drip of water from the bothy's turf roof was the only sound as she laid him on a bed of bracken and carefully tended to his wounds. Her touch was gentle yet hesitant, a dance between mercy and fear. She knew that what she was doing was an act of treason, an unforgivable betrayal of her clan. "He wears the king's colours," she thought, her inner monologue a frantic prayer. "The livery of the men who hunt my father. But to leave him to the wolves, it is a sin my soul could not bear. What have I done?" For 2 days and 2 nights Aidan drifted in a fevered haze, his murmurs about protecting the royal seal the only words he spoke. Isla, a sentinel in the dark, sat beside him, the firelight from the peat fire playing over his face, revealing a handsomeness she had not seen in the cold rain. He was a stranger, an enemy, and yet she found herself drawn to him, to the subtle vulnerability etched in his features. The loch's dark water, ever watchful, kept their secret, holding them in a fragile peace. For the moment, in the heart of the Highlands, there was no king, no clan, no war. There were only two people, a man and a woman, bound together by a single act of compassion, their future as uncertain as the mist-shrouded peaks that surrounded them. The bothy, so remote and clandestine a refuge, became a world unto itself. Its confined space, lit by the perpetual smoky heart of the peat fire, was an intimacy forced upon them by circumstance. The atmosphere, once fraught with a sense of peril, softened into a quiet watchfulness. The outside world was a memory, a looming threat that waited just beyond the bothy's low, moss-choked door. As Aidan slowly mended under Isla's care, their days fell into a rhythm of hushed conversations and comfortable silences. He watched her, a woman utterly at home in this wild world, her strength a silent, beautiful thing. Her hands, nimble with the healing knowledge passed down through generations, were equally adept at weaving straw or stirring the savoury porridge she made from oats. She was no court lady, polished and perfumed, but a woman of the earth, her hair a wild, dark cascade, her eyes as deep and mysterious as the loch outside. Isla in turn began to see beyond the uniform and the royal seal. She saw the lines of exhaustion and the shadow of duty on his face, the quiet intelligence in his eyes, and a deep-seated goodness that belied his allegiance. The man, not the enemy, was beginning to emerge. One afternoon, a child from the clan, a small boy with a shock of red hair, ventured onto the island, chasing a lost lamb. He was too young to understand the dangers of their hidden bothy, and too innocent to be afraid. Isla spoke to him in a soft, low Gaelic, soothing him with her presence. As he sat by the shore, lonely and afraid, Aidan, still too weak to venture outside, watched through the crack in the bothy's door. He saw the boy, tears streaming down his face, and without a thought reached for a piece of old dried driftwood. His strong hands, once trained for the battle, the hilt of a sword or the quill of a scribe, now began to carve. With a skill that was surprising in its grace and focus, he whittled away at the wood, coaxing forth the delicate shape of a small bird. He handed it to Isla, a silent gesture, a plea for peace. Isla took the bird and gave it to the boy, watching as his tear-streaked face lit up with a small, grateful smile. He ran off, holding the bird like a treasure, and Isla felt something in her heart thaw. The act was so simple, so unexpectedly kind, a thing of tenderness and goodwill that had no place in the violent world they inhabited. It was a language without words, a language of the soul that spoke of a different sort of man than the king's couriers she knew. She looked at Aidan, a question in her eyes, a question to which he had no answer. The fragile peace was shattered 2 days later by the arrival of her father, the MacLaren chieftain. He was a formidable figure, a man weathered by a lifetime of raids and vengeance. His face, etched with the scars of 100 battles, was as harsh and unyielding as the granite peaks that surrounded them. He spoke in a guttural Gaelic that rolled like a coming storm, his words full of a quiet menace. "His life is sacred under my roof," he said to Isla, his eyes dark and knowing, never leaving Aidan's face. "The moment he's well enough to stand, he is gone. Do you understand, daughter?" Isla nodded, the unspoken threat a palpable thing between the two men. It was the law of the Highlands, the unwritten code of a warrior chieftain. A guest's life was protected, but a king's man was still an enemy. Her father saw what she saw, felt what she felt, but his loyalty was to his clan, a bond forged in centuries of bloodshed and tradition. The warmth of the peat fire seemed to falter in the face of his cold authority, casting long, threatening shadows on the bothy walls. That night, as the fire died to a heap of glowing embers, Aidan looked at Isla. "Why do you do this?" he asked, his voice low and raspy. "I am your enemy." Isla, sitting in the corner, her knees pulled to her chest, answered without hesitation. "You are a man, wounded and alone. That is all I see." The simple truth of her words hung in the air, a final testament to the fragile peace they had found. He was the king's man, she the outlaw's daughter. They were two worlds apart, but in the small firelit sanctuary of the bothy, an impossible connection had begun to blossom, a connection as vital and as dangerous as the wild land they called home. The peace was fleeting, a stolen moment before the storm. Eden, his strength now returned, was permitted to walk the shores of the island, a prisoner and a guest under the watchful eye of the clan. In these stolen moments of freedom, he and Isla talked. They spoke of the world beyond the loch, a world of kings and courts, of laws and levies. Isla in turn told him of her life, of the ancient traditions of her people, of a loyalty that was bred in the bone and ran deeper than any king's decree. Their bond, forged in the hushed intimacy of the bothy, deepened with each shared story, each quiet touch of hands that felt more than they dared to say. They were two halves of a whole, a lowland courtier and a highland girl, finding a common language in their secret world. But the world outside would not be denied. One afternoon, as a leaden autumn sky hung oppressively over the loch, casting its waters into a sombre, unyielding grey, Isla's brother, a fierce, hot-headed warrior, came to the bothy. He had discovered the leather pouch that held the king's letter, sealed with the royal signet, a cold, unyielding feel of authority in its weight. His eyes, dark with fury, were fixed on Aidan, a viper who had been given a place at their hearth. "She has brought a viper to our breast," he raged, in a mix of Gaelic and a harsh, broken English, his voice echoing over the quiet loch. "While we hide like foxes, she gives comfort to the hunter." His words, sharp as a dirk, split the fragile unity of the clan. Whispers spread like wildfire, turning suspicion into accusation and trust into betrayal. Eden was a spy, a tool of the king sent to discover their hiding place and bring them to ruin. The chieftain, a man torn between his love for his daughter and his duty to his clan, sat in stony silence, his suspicion as palpable as the cold grey air. Aidan, tormented by his own duty and his growing love for Isla, stood accused. He held the king's signet ring, the cold metal a reminder of his oath, and he realised with a sickening lurch that the letter he carried might contain the very orders for the clan's destruction. The weight of it felt like a lifetime of betrayal. He was caught in an impossible bind, a choice between two loyalties, either path leading to ruin. He remembered the words his friend had spoken to him before he'd set out on his journey, a warning about the world he was entering. This Highland chieftain, so fierce, so untamed in his nature, he cannot be made to understand the laws of the king. He is a king in his own right, and you are a servant of a servant. Be careful, for in the wilds, loyalties are decided by the heart, not by a crown. A man of honour can be found on either side of a war. The mournful cry of a distant loon cut through the oppressive silence, a sound as lonely as Aidan's own heart. He looked at Isla, her face pale and full of a desperate fear, and he knew that he had to make a choice. If he delivered the letter, he would betray her and her people, the only family who had ever offered him a sanctuary. But if he did not, he would be a traitor to his king, an oath-breaker. The choice was a torment, a slow poison that was eating at his soul. He had to decide between the man he was sworn to be and the man he had become. He left the bothy, walking aimlessly on the shore, the cold, unyielding feel of the signet ring in his pocket. The oppressive greyness of the autumn sky, the restless murmur of the loch's dark water, reflected the turmoil inside him. He was a man with two allegiances, a man with two lives, and there was no way to save them both. As a low, biting wind whipped his hair and stung his cheeks, he thought of Isla's face, of her quiet strength, her deep-seated goodness. He thought of his duty, of the king's commands, of the world he was a part of. The choice was a terrible one, a choice that would break a heart or shatter a world. The decision was made not by reason, but by the reckless fury of love. That night, a wild tempest raged over the highlands, the storm inside mirroring the tempest outside. The wind howled like a banshee, and the loch thrashed with a violent, untamable power, casting sheets of ruin against the bothy door. Inside, surrounded by the shadows of a dying fire, Isla's brother, hot with fury and suspicion, made his final plan. He would kill Aidan, a simple act of violence to protect his clan. Isla, a girl grown to a woman in the wild, heard the whispers of her brother and his men, and a cold, chilling dread seized her heart. She found Aidan by the shore, a small worn boat tethered to the rocks, ready to sail into the stormy night. He was going to leave her, to leave the clan to their fate, to face his own doom alone. "I have to go," he said, his voice as rough and wild as the wind. "To deliver my message, to serve my king, I cannot do less." "And what about me? What about us?" she asked, a tear-filled rain stinging her face. He had no answer. Oh, their fear and desperation, a thing long suppressed, erupted into a passionate confrontation, a battle fought with words, tears, and a fierce, unyielding love. They clung to each other in the howling wind and rain, their bodies pressed together, a silent vow of love made in the heart of the storm. His mouth claimed hers with a raw hunger, a hunger born of his inner turmoil, of the life he was giving up, of the love he was fighting for. Her hands, delicate and small, tangled in his wet hair, pulling him closer, her body arching against his, a fiery, desperate thing that sought to consume him. There was no gentleness in this, no quiet tenderness, but a fierce, aching need to feel, to connect, to exist for a moment outside of their impossible loyalties. His hands roamed her back, her waist, his touch a brand of possession and a plea for forgiveness all at once. His hand slid lower, exploring her with a primal reverence and a raw hunger he had never known. The coarse wool of her tunic and his doublet chafed against their skin, but they were oblivious, their need a physical force that transcended mere fabric. He kissed her like he was breathing her in, each brush of his mouth deepening the ache in her chest. His hands traced the curve of her back, drawing shivers that left her breathless. When he laid her gently on the wet sand, the rain lashed at them, but they felt only the heat of their shared bodies, a dance of need and tenderness, where every sigh seemed to carry a lifetime of longing. Clothes fell away, skin meeting skin in a heated rush that stole their breath. He moved with her slowly at first, savouring the way her body arched and trembled beneath his touch, then faster as their shared need consumed them in waves of pleasure. Her cries, a mixture of surrender and ecstasy, were lost to the wind, carried off into the wild night. They were two souls, two bodies, two worlds colliding in a storm of love and desire, a single moment of absolute, devastating clarity. His hands held her like flowers, so still and strange. When it was over, he held her close, his arms around her, his face buried in her neck, and they lay there on the silver strand of the loch, two lovers who had found each other in the heart of the storm, a love as wild and untamable as the highland wind. The tempest had passed, leaving in its wake a calm, clear morning. The sun, a golden orb in a washed clean sky, glinted on the calm surface of the loch, a mirror reflecting the fragile peace that had settled over the island. But in the bothy, a quiet reckoning was taking place, a reckoning not with arms, but with words and honour. Eden, having made his choice, stood before Ela and her father, the MacLaren chieftain. His clothes were damp, his face etched with a silent resolve. The king's letter, once a symbol of his duty, was now a testament to his love. He broke the royal seal and laid the letter before the chieftain. It did not contain orders for a raid, but rather a final offer of pardon for the McLarens if they would swear fealty to the crown. It was an offer that, with Aidan's failure to deliver it, would die on the wind, leaving the clan to face the full force of the king's wrath. He looked at the chieftain, a man so like his daughter in his quiet strength and fierce loyalty, and said, his voice low but firm, "I will return to the king, not as a courier, but as a man who has come to know and respect your people. I will plead your case not with the words of a king, but with the heart of a man. I will risk my own life and honour for a chance at peace." The chieftain, a man who understood the language of honour better than that of the law, looked at Aidan, his face a mask of solemn respect. He saw in Aidan's eyes not the fear of a captive, but the courage of a man who would fight for what was right. He provided Aidan with a new boat and safe passage through his territory, an act of trust that would not be forgotten. Isla's brother, shamed by the revelation, offered a grudging nod of respect, a silent apology for his hastiness. Before he left, Aidan found Isla on the silver strand of the loch, the place where she had found him, and where their love had been forged in the heart of the storm. The morning sun warmed the sand, a gentle counterpoint to the cold rain of the night before. This was a kiss of serene acceptance, not frantic loss. His hand cupped her cheek, his thumb stroking her skin as if to memorize her, and he whispered, "I will come back for you." A promise that was both a prayer and a vow. She leaned into his touch, her eyes holding his, conveying all the words they could not say. It was a quiet, searing moment of connection, a promise of a future they would fight to create. Their love was a fragile hope set against the vast, unforgiving beauty of the Highlands. He was a man who had learned that true honour lies not in blind obedience, but in fighting for what is right, even at great personal cost. She was a woman who had learned to see the humanity in her enemy and to trust her own heart over the prejudices of her people. They were a bridge between two worlds, a love born in the shadow of a crown and nurtured in the heart of the wild. He rode away, a small figure on the vast, sun-drenched loch. She watched him go, a sense of hope blooming in her heart, a flower among the sharp thorns of her life. And so, a love story, forged in the tumult of the Scottish Highlands, awaited the turning of the tide. A promise whispered on the wind, a hope held fast in the heart of a brave Highland girl. Aidan and Isla, a tale of love that would become a legend. Until the last horizon. The USS Mercy bucked like a dying beast, groaning beneath the impact of what felt like 1,000 hammers. Nurse Evelyn Carter, her white uniform already stained with oil and fear, gripped the rail of the sickbay. The air, thick with the metallic tang of blood and the acrid bite of smoke, clawed at her throat. "Hold on!" she shouted, her voice thin against the cacophony of groaning steel and distant explosions. Her hands, usually so steady and precise, trembled as she tried to secure a bandage on a young corporal's arm, his eyes wide with a terror that mirrored her own. Outside, the roar of anti-aircraft guns was a continuous, futile prayer against the relentless onslaught. This wasn't the orderly chaos of a hospital ward, but the raw, unbridled savagery of war itself, swallowing the very sea beneath them. A shudder, more violent than any before, ripped through the ship. A deafening blast tore through the deck just aft of them, showering them with hot debris. The corporal cried out, his grip slipping from her frantic hold. Evelyn felt herself lifted, then flung into the churning blackness that was once the Pacific's serene expanse. The icy shock of the water, thick with oil and the debris of destruction, stole her breath. She fought instinctively against the crushing current, the distant screams of men fading as the ocean's cold embrace pulled her under. Darkness, then a terrifying, brilliant white flash, and then nothing. A gasp tore through her, raw and involuntary as she fought her way back to the surface, spluttering. The world was gone. The noise, the smoke, the screams, all of it replaced by a blue so deep it hurt the eyes. And him, a stranger's face etched with a grimness that felt older than the war itself. He knelt over her, his own face smeared with grime, a fresh, angry gash weeping crimson along his forearm. He was dragging her, inch by agonizing inch, from the gentle lapping of the waves onto the blinding white sand of a beach. She coughed, salt water burning her throat. Her mind, a jumble of fragmented images, the sinking ship, the faces of her patients, the impossible blue of the sky, struggled to find purchase. This was not the chaotic, fiery inferno she remembered. This was an unnerving silence, broken only by the gentle shush of the waves and the distant cry of seabirds. The air, once heavy with smoke and death, was now clean, fragrant with unknown blossoms and the salt tang of a pristine ocean. It was a silence so profound it was almost louder than the explosions that had brought them here. "You're awake!" A gruff voice cut through her daze. Mateo Ramirez. His eyes, dark and unwavering, assessed her with a pragmatic intensity that offered no comfort, only fact. "Don't try to move yet. You swallowed a good deal of water." He didn't offer a hand, didn't soften his tone. He was a man of action, not solace, and his immediate focus was on survival. His uniform, like hers, was torn and stained, clinging to his muscular frame. A torn pocket revealed a faint glimpse of dog tags. Evelyn managed a weak nod, her limbs heavy and unresponsive. The pain in her head throbbed with the rhythm of her bewildered heart. She looked around, her gaze sweeping the pristine curve of the beach, framed by swaying palms. It was too beautiful to be real, a painted backdrop for a nightmare. And then, at the edge of the water, half submerged in the gentle surf, lay the wreckage of a single lifeboat, a constant broken reminder of their old world. It was a grim monument to their isolation. "My arm," Mateo said, his voice curt, jolting her from her daze. "It needs tending." Her nurse's training, a finely honed instinct, asserted itself over the lingering shock. Her hands, though still trembling, found purpose. She tore a strip from the hem of her soaked uniform skirt. It was not sterile, not ideal, but it was all they had. She cleaned the wound as best she could with what little fresh water Mateo had managed to collect in a cupped palm, her touch surprisingly delicate despite the urgency. His gaze, steady and intense, never left her face, watching her every movement with an unnerving scrutiny. He didn't wince, didn't complain, simply endured. "It's deep," she murmured, her voice still hoarse. "It needs stitches, but—" She trailed off, the stark reality of their situation pressing down. No medical supplies, no operating theatre, no fellow nurses. Only the vast, indifferent ocean and the terrifying beauty of this unknown land. "It'll do," he replied, a stoic acceptance in his tone. "Better than nothing." He watched her tie the makeshift bandage, a grim appreciation in his eyes. He saw the competence, not the terror that still lurked beneath her professional facade. It was a strange sort of validation, stark and unadorned. As the sun began its slow descent, painting the sky in hues of fiery orange and soft violet, the pragmatic corporal began to move. While Evelyn rested, still weak and disoriented, Mateo scoured the immediate vicinity. He found a small freshwater spring bubbling up from porous rock, and soon the rhythmic thwack of his machete, rescued somehow from the chaos, against palm fronds filled the air. He was a man utterly in his element, carving order from the chaos, while she was a woman whose well-ordered life had been shattered into a million glittering pieces. Her upbringing in a proper Boston home, with its strictures and its quiet expectations, felt a million miles away, a fragile dream against the raw, unyielding reality of their present. The shelter he fashioned was crude, a lean-to of woven palm fronds offering scant protection, but it was shelter nonetheless. He worked with an almost brutal efficiency, his movements economical, driven by an innate understanding of survival. He didn't speak much, his focus unwavering, his gaze constantly scanning the horizon, the trees, the ground, ever vigilant. As dusk deepened, bringing with it a sudden drop in temperature, Evelyn huddled beneath the meagre cover of the fronds, watching him. He started a small fire, coaxing flames from dry tinders with a practiced ease that awed her. The flickering light cast his features into sharp relief, highlighting the strong lines of his jaw, the tired but resolute set of his mouth. He was a stranger, yet he was their only hope, their only tether to life. She thought of her world, the one that was gone, the quiet hum of the hospital, the crisp scent of antiseptic, the gentle murmur of Boston Common in autumn. Here the air hummed with the unknown, with the raw, untamed essence of nature. She was Nurse Evelyn Carter, and she was adrift, marooned not just on an island, but from every facet of her former existence. And beside her, Corporal Mateo Ramirez, a man who seemed to embody the wild, untamed spirit of this new reality. They were a study in contrasts, her genteel upbringing versus his raw pragmatism, her quiet despair against his grim determination. The acrid smell of smoke and salt water still clung to her, a phantom of the wreck. But now it mingled with the clean green scent of the jungle and the wood smoke from their fire. The jarring silence of the island, broken only by the cry of seabirds, was slowly, imperceptibly, settling around them, claiming them. Weeks bled into months on the atoll, marked less by the calendar that no longer existed, and more by the steady rhythm of the tide and the slow, inexorable turning of the seasons. The island, once a symbol of their terrifying isolation, began to reveal itself as something else entirely, a verdant, vibrant prison that slowly, miraculously transformed into a sanctuary. The initial stark awe of survival settled into a quiet, almost contemplative routine, akin to the slow unfolding of unspoken understanding that Elizabeth Gaskell so masterfully depicted. Mateo, with his innate connection to the wild, became their guide. He taught Evelyn how to weave palm fronds not just for a crude lean-to, but for a sturdier, more comfortable shelter that could withstand the tropical downpours. His large, calloused hands, once terrifying in their gruff efficiency, now moved with a patient dexterity as he showed her how to fashion a sharpened stick into a rudimentary fishing spear. He taught her to read the subtle signs of the sea, to know where the fish ran, when the tide would turn. Evelyn, in turn, with her precise observational skills honed by years of nursing, discovered edible roots and berries, identifying them from the myriad of unknown flora. She cultivated a small meticulous garden near their freshwater spring, coaxing life from the rich island soil, a small patch of order in the grand wildness. Their professional distance, born of the ship's hierarchy and the shock of their shared ordeal, softened into a necessary partnership, each relying on the other's unique strengths. The silent language of shared survival gradually eclipsed the formal address. It was no longer Nurse Carter and Corporal Ramirez, but simply Evelyn and Mateo. One afternoon a torrential tropical storm descended upon the island, a furious symphony of wind and rain that lashed at their little shelter. They were forced into the close confines of their woven sanctuary, the world outside a roaring, impenetrable wall of water. The dim light, the drumming rain on the fronds, and the sheer force of the elements trapped them, forcing an intimacy born of necessity. To pass the endless hours and distract from the primal fear that stirred within them both, they began to speak, truly speak for the first time. Evelyn spoke of her life in Boston, a world of brownstone houses, hushed libraries and the polite society gatherings where every word was measured, every emotion carefully veiled. She spoke of her aspirations to serve, to heal, the quiet satisfaction of her nursing career. "I always thought my life was planned," she confessed, her voice soft against the drumming rain. "Like a railway line, college, nursing, marriage to someone suitable. It never occurred to me that one could simply be. Here, there are no expectations, only existence." Matteo listened, his dark eyes fixed on the flickering shadows cast by their small lamp. Then slowly, hesitantly at first, he began to speak of his own world, the vibrant, challenging upbringing in a Los Angeles barrio, the sprawling, boisterous family, the street-level pragmatism that had shaped him. He spoke of the struggle, the hustle, the constant need to prove himself in a society that often saw only his name, not his character. He described the laughter, the fierce loyalty, the rich tapestry of his community. As he spoke, the gruff corporal, the survivalist, faded, and the complex, passionate man beneath the uniform emerged. This was the first time they truly saw the person behind the uniform, the stories etched into their souls. The storm raged, but within their shelter a different kind of calm settled, a deep, resonant understanding. The space between them, once filled with unspoken formality, was now permeable, inviting. A week later, a moment of profound, almost shocking connection occurred. Evelyn, wading in the shallows searching for shellfish, cried out sharply. A translucent ribbon of pain, white-hot and immediate, shot up her leg. A jellyfish. Matteo, who had been fishing nearby, was at her side in an instant. His face, usually so impassive, contorted with concern. He scooped her into his arms with surprising ease, carrying her back to their camp. He laid her gently on their palm-frond bed. The light was fading, casting the small shelter in a soft, ethereal glow. His hands, which had built their world, were now incredibly gentle as he examined the angry red welt on her calf. He crushed some local leaves he knew for their soothing properties, mixing them with a little fresh water, and then, with infinite care, applied the poultice to her skin. His touch was feather-light, stripped of all pretense, devoid of conscious thought, merely concern. Evelyn watched him, her breath catching in her throat. The pain from the sting was sharp, but a deeper, more profound sensation was blossoming within her. She saw the crinkle at the corners of his eyes, the slight furrow of his brow, the concentration in his gaze. He wasn't Matteo the corporal, Matteo the survivalist. He was simply Matteo, a man tending to her, his vulnerability laid bare in the quiet intensity of his care. The air crackled with a new palpable awareness, a delicate thread of desire woven into the fabric of their shared existence. When his fingers brushed her skin, a shiver, entirely unrelated to the pain, traced its way up her spine. The silence that followed was charged, electric, filled with unspoken words and the burgeoning understanding that this island had given them more than just survival. It had given them each other. Matteo watched her sleep later that night, the dim light of the fire playing across her features. In her world, a man like him would be invisible, or worse, a curiosity, a temporary deviation from the norm. Here, she saw him, just him, the man, not the label. The steady rhythm of the tide marking their days seemed to echo the beat of his own heart, a heart that was beginning to belong to this place, and to the woman beside him. The shared taste of roasted fish and coconut, once a simple necessity, was now flavoured with the quiet intimacy of their days, and on the small shelf she had fashioned from driftwood, her growing collection of smoothed sea glass and shells glittered in the firelight, creating beauty amidst the wildness, a symbol of Evelyn's quiet transformation. The second year on the island unfolded with a gentle, almost dreamlike cadence. Their life had settled into a comfortable domestic rhythm, a harmony born of shared labour and unspoken understanding. The days were a warm tapestry woven with the silver of dawn, the golden haze of midday, and the velvet indigo of the starlit nights. Yet beneath this idyllic surface a current of melancholy began to stir, a quiet fear of the outside world, akin to the atmospheric tension that often precedes a storm. One morning the tides, ever the bringers of both sustenance and sorrow, delivered something alien to their pristine shores. Debris, not the familiar flotsam of fallen coconuts or washed-up coral, but something starkly, terrifyingly human. A tattered American flag, faded and torn but unmistakably its colours, was snagged on a piece of a splintered raft. Beside it, incongruously, lay a waterlogged journal, its leather cover warped and swollen, its pages a pulpy mass, yet still bearing the ghost of printed words. Matteo, ever vigilant, was the first to find them. His call to Evelyn was not the usual cheerful summons to a fresh catch, but a low guttural sound that spoke of dread. They stood together side by side on the sand, gazing at the grim offerings of the sea. The flag, a symbol of the world they'd left behind, now felt like a shroud, heavy with the weight of unspeakable losses. Evelyn, with her innate reverence for human stories, carefully, almost reverently opened the journal. The ink had bled, the paper was fragile, but some entries were still legible, a ghostly testament to a young sailor's final days. His words spoke of battles won and lost, of comrades fallen, of a world that had moved on without them, a world still steeped in the brutal theatre of war. The reality of time passing, of their families believing them dead, settled heavily between them, a cold, oppressive weight that extinguished the island's warmth. "They've mourned me," Evelyn whispered, her voice a fragile reed, tears streaming unchecked down her face. "They've had a funeral, my mother. Oh, Matteo. My mother put on a black dress and said goodbye to a ghost." The words were a lament, a cry for a life irrevocably lost, for the pain her disappearance had surely caused. The peace of the island, once a balm, now felt like a cruel deception. Matteo stood silent, his back to her, staring out at the ocean that had brought them here, and now brought these grim reminders. He picked up a piece of driftwood, absently turning it over and over in his hands. His silence was not lack of feeling, but a profound, almost terrifying withdrawal. He was grappling with his own demons, with the stark, unavoidable truth of a future he had dared to forget. "They find us, Evelyn?" he asked, his voice rough, devoid of its usual warmth. It was less a question and more a statement of bleak certainty. "What then? You go back to your world and I go back to mine. There's a bigger ocean between Boston and my home than this one." He didn't turn to face her, his gaze fixed on the endless horizon, on the chasm of class and racial prejudice that separated their origins, a chasm that had seemed to vanish on this isolated patch of land. His words were not a rejection of her, but a raw articulation of a fear that had haunted him his entire life, the fear of being an outsider, of never truly belonging. The discovery created the first real emotional distance between them. Evelyn wept for the family she had lost, for the innocent life she had once led, now irrevocably altered. She mourned the future that had been stolen. Matteo, meanwhile, grew quiet and withdrawn, his usual pragmatism replaced by a brooding despondency. He was haunted by the thought of returning to a country where he'd still have to fight for basic respect, where the colour of his skin, the sound of his name, would define him more than his courage or his capabilities. The idea of a relationship with a woman like Evelyn, a woman of her social standing in that world, seemed not just impossible, but a cruel joke. The island, which had been their sanctuary, now felt like a fragile bubble, easily burst by the sharp edges of reality. The tattered, sun-bleached flag flapped mournfully in the gentle breeze, a silent sentinel to their lost innocence. The ghostly faded ink of the sailor's journal lay open, its pages whispering tales of a brutal world they had forgotten but could not escape. And the most painful anchor of all was the sudden, oppressive silence that fell between them, a silence where comfortable quiet once lived, now filled with the unspoken weight of their diverging futures. They walked the beach separately, ate their meals in quietude, the effortless camaraderie that had blossomed between them replaced by a chasm of unspoken anxieties. The horizon, once a promise of endless possibility, now seemed to press in, confining them. Nearly 3 years had passed since the USS Mercy surrendered to the sea, since Evelyn and Matteo had been cast onto this Eden. The island was no longer merely a place of survival. It was their home, intricately woven into the fabric of their beings. Their days had become a quiet epic, each sunrise a testament to their resilience, each sunset a whispered promise of another, shared tomorrow. But the quiet tension born of the shipwreck journal had festered, an unaddressed wound between them, a constant reminder of the world they had fled. Then, one sun-drenched afternoon, Matteo saw it first. A glint in the impossibly blue sky, a silver fish flashing against the boundless azure. It was a minuscule speck at first, easily dismissed as a trick of the light, but his eyes, honed by years of scanning horizons and searching for signs, knew better. A hum, faint but growing, reached his ears, a sound alien and terrifyingly familiar. An American reconnaissance plane. Instinct sharpened by the military training and a deep-seated sense of duty took over. Evelyn, he roared, his voice urgent, cutting through the island's serene hum. He began frantically gathering dry palm fronds, branches, anything that would burn. His face, usually so readable to her now, was a mask of profound conflict. Grim determination battling with a sorrow that threatened to consume him. The signal fire, a beacon to salvation, was also a funeral pyre for their private world. They worked together, their movements swift and wordless, a synchronized dance born of years of unspoken partnership. Smoke billowed into the sky, a dark plume against the brilliant blue, a desperate message to the world that had forgotten them. They knew rescue is now inevitable. The coming dawn will bring ships, men, and the shattering end of their secluded existence. The knowledge hung between them, heavy and suffocating, both a prayer answered and a sentence pronounced. Their hearts, once beating in unison with the island's quiet rhythm, now hammered with a frantic, desperate urgency. That night, the signal fire burned like a funeral pyre for their life on the island, casting long, dancing shadows that mimicked their restless hearts. They didn't speak of the rescue, didn't utter the words that would make it real, make it undeniable. Instead, under the brilliant, indifferent canopy of stars, their silent witnesses, the only constant from their old life to their new one, they came together in a moment of profound, sorrowful, and deeply loving surrender. It was not a physical demand, but an aching acknowledgement of their impending loss, a desperate attempt to memorize each other before they are torn apart. Matteo reached out, his rough palm cupping her cheek with impossible softness, his thumb tracing the delicate curve of her jaw. His eyes, usually so guarded, were raw with emotion, reflecting the flickering firelight and a desperate, boundless longing. He kissed her not with the simple affection that had grown between them over the past years, but with the force of a man trying to breathe in a memory, to absorb every facet of her being into his very soul. His lips, at first tentative, grew urgent, deepening the ache in her chest, a silent plea for time to stop. Her gasp turned into a soft moan as his hands traced her back, her waist, the gentle curve of her hip, as if mapping a beloved land he was about to lose, an Eden about to vanish. Her answering touch was just as desperate, her fingers tangling in his dark, thick hair, pulling him closer, pressing their bodies together until there was no space left between them, only the electric current of shared despair and undiluted desire. When their bodies pressed together, it was a silent language of need and tenderness, a rightness to it, a feeling sound of coming home that resonated deep within her bones. It was fire and fragility all at once, a dance where every sigh, every tremor, every whispered breath carried the weight of 3 years of shared life and the terror of the coming day. The coolness of the night air on their exposed skin was a stark contrast to the heat that flared between them, a feverish testament to their connection. The scent of salt from the ocean mingled with the sweet, heavy perfume of the night-blooming flowers Evelyn loved, clinging to her hair, a bitter-sweet aroma of their sanctuary. The only sounds were the soft shush of the waves, the crackle of their dying fire, and the mingled rhythm of their breathing, ragged and uneven. Their touch was a sacred anchor in a world about to be swept away, a fervent, unspoken marriage vow made in their Eden on its final night. The taste of salt, not from the sea but from their unwept tears, mingled on their lips, sealing their desperate promise. The rescue was a cacophonous assault on senses accustomed to the quiet rhythm of the tides. The blare of ship horns, the shouts of men, the blinding glare of searchlights was a jarring, dissonant symphony after years of wind and waves. Evelyn and Matteo, disoriented and overwhelmed, were separated almost immediately. She was whisked away, debriefed by eager officers, celebrated as Nurse Carter, a remarkable survivor. He, Corporal Ramirez, was likewise hailed, a decorated but still marginalized soldier. The starched sheets of the infirmary felt alien, the proper clothing stiff and suffocating after the freedom of their simple island wear. Every sound, every unfamiliar face was a reminder of a world that had moved on without them, a world they no longer fit into. The moment Evelyn stepped back on American soil, the invisible walls of society rose between them, stark and unyielding. Her family, tearful with relief, welcomed her back to their Boston brownstone. Their joy, however, was tinged with a polite horror at her profound, palpable connection to Matteo. Her mother, ever the pillar of Bostonian propriety, the ordeal and the need to forget, to return to her old life, her pre-war self. She spoke of suitable matches, of rebuilding a respectable future. But the girl who'd been cast ashore with Matteo, the woman who'd built a life from wreckage, was not the same one who had boarded the USS Mercy. Matteo faced his own battles. His family in Los Angeles welcomed him with boisterous relief, but the underlying currents of prejudice, the subtle slights, the unspoken expectations, remained. The world he had left, the world he had fought for, was still the same one where a man like him was judged by his name and background rather than his character. The freedom of the island, where he was simply Matteo, a man valued for his strength and ingenuity, felt like a distant, impossible dream. The pressure mounted, subtle yet relentless. Friends and family attempted to steer Evelyn back into her pre-war social circles, away from the unconventional attachment she had formed. Matteo was encouraged to rejoin his own community, to seek a future more realistic for a man of his background. The unspoken rules of the era, the societal divides, seemed insurmountable. But Evelyn and Matteo, forged in the crucible of shared survival, had found a strength within themselves that was more than a match for society's disapproval. Their love, nurtured in isolation, had grown beyond mere necessity. It was a profound choice, a radical act of defiance. They found each other again, first in hushed phone calls, then in clandestine meetings, their hands finding each other's, in the crowded anonymity of train stations and bustling city streets. They chose each other not out of convenience or a shared past, but out of a love that has been tested by literal and figurative isolation, refined by hardship, and deepened by an understanding that transcended class, race, and societal expectation. Weeks later, they found their first moment of true privacy since the rescue, not in a grand home or a familiar room, but in a simple, anonymous boarding house in a small town where no one knew their names, where their past was their own. The world outside was loud, the jarring sounds of traffic and city life a stark contrast to the gentle shush of island waves. But in this small space, behind a locked door, they rediscovered their own quiet rhythm. The lovemaking here was different from that desperate, sorrowful surrender on the island's final night. It was less frantic, more deliberate, a tender, passionate reclamation. He traced the faint lines on her skin, the remnants of sun and sea, the indelible marks of their shared history. His fingers lingered on the calluses that had formed on her palms from weaving and gardening, those hands that had learned to build a home. Evelyn held his hand, her own fingers tracing the rough, familiar landscape of his calloused palm, feeling the strength that had saved her, the tenderness that had cherished her. It was a confirmation, deep and resonant, that their love was not an island fantasy. It was their truest reality, a portable sanctuary they could build anywhere, a love that transcended the world's expectations. Evelyn Carter, no longer bound by rules, now made them. She had shed the skin of her former self, returning to the world as a woman defined by her own courage and her unwavering heart. Mateo Ramirez, returning to America, carried not cynicism but a new, unshakable sense of self-worth anchored by Evelyn's love. He was ready to fight for his place in the world, not just as a soldier, but as a man worthy of happiness, worthy of her. They had been saved from the sea, only to find that their true rescue was from the world they had left behind, and in each other's arms they had found an island that no ocean, no prejudice, no societal expectation could ever wash away. The single perfect seashell Evelyn kept, a tangible piece of their shared Eden, sat on their modest bedside table, a silent testament to the extraordinary love that had blossomed in the heart of their own extraordinary horizon.